Oh yeah, end times, everyone's favorite. I'm sure the comment section for this video will be a hive of rational discourse and friendly conversation. Today, I want to talk about the end times a bit more, but where in the past we've kind of focused more on lord characters, this video is all about units, quite a few of which we've only briefly mentioned or never even talked about before. Now, the apocalyptic finale to Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the destruction of the mortal realms, was, and still is, a pretty divisive topic, but no matter how you feel about it, there was a lot that came with it. A lot of lore, a lot of new characters, a lot of new rules, and a lot of new units. And this is content Creative Assembly might start delving into once Warhammer 3 is well underway. And sure, feel free to quote that random dev saying the game isn't set during the end times till you're blue in the face. We already know it's a lightning in a bottle approach, not a strict timeline. They can and have pulled bits and bobs from any part of the setting they want. And that quote's from 2015 now. Safe to say things have changed a bit since then. We're going on 5 years. So when we're talking about the units that got added at the tail end of Warhammer Fantasy Battle's 8th edition, there are a few things we have to think about. Things that are worth discussing and debating when it comes to their implementation in this Total War trilogy. And the first things that come to mind are the visuals, the art direction, and the overall design. Is their design a substantial visual departure from content that already exists in universe? Do they look like they fit in the roster and with the lore that's been written for them and their faction at large? Because if they don't, if they look like a unit that belongs in Dune or 40k or some other fantasy universe, and there's no way to do anything about that design, then perhaps it doesn't belong in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And if it doesn't fit their thematics or their playstyle for a particular faction, perhaps it doesn't belong in the game at all. It's why I don't like Shard Dragons and Rune Golems for the Dwarfs, why I don't like elite, cost-efficient infantry for the Vampire Coast, or Manticore Lords for the Dark Elves. I feel like they make factions strong in areas they should not be strong in, kind of screw with asymmetrical balance, and aren't particularly thematic or well thought out from a lore perspective either. But just for fair disclosure, and I think most of you are aware of this by now, I generally err on the side of the more content, the better. The more factions, the more lords, the more units we have, the better this trilogy will be. Obviously, there are exceptions. Is the unit redundant, functioning at the exact same tier in the exact same role as one or more other units? I don't think redundancy is inherently bad. I think it's fine to have multiple troop choices that perform similar functions, but there comes a point where unit bloat and poorly balanced rosters can make battles feel like a chore. Can this unit be balanced effectively so as not to completely outshine what's come before and make earlier units undesirable and not contribute overly much to the power creep we've already seen take root in this series? And ultimately, can it sell product? Will their inclusion make the game better, more exciting to play, and actually drive sales? And this is quite literally the bottom line question. CA is a business, so if they get the okay from Games Workshop and they believe their artists are capable of tackling a particular unit, the only remaining obstacle is the question of whether or not putting it in the game will make them money. Because if it will, they're probably going to do it. A lot of this comes down to subjective viewpoints, of course, but those are the questions that should be buzzing in the back of your brain when these units come up on screen and whether we're debating if a unit should come into the game or not. And as with everything else swirling around the end times, there's been a lot of debate about the models themselves. I think the most common criticism of end times units are that they're overly designed. They're too colorful, too futuristic, too 40k. And I think there's elements of truth to those claims, certainly for some of the models, but when I take a look at where Games Workshop was only a few editions back and where they are now, and then I think about what would work better in video game form, there's no question in my mind the late 8th edition models and all that stuff translates way better for Total War Warhammer than the stuff from earlier editions. I mean, seriously, dude. Look at that. Imagine having Skeletor, the king of Meow, Shay, Meow, become the supreme leader of Nagash's legions in Game 3. Dude on the left is astounding. He blows my mind. The difference of quality in those models is astounding. For me, it's not even a competition. End times Nagash is the Nagash to go for. The Skelly boy on the left is one goofy-ass dude from a long time past. And I mean, you can even look at the models from 6th and 7th, and the gulf in quality between them and the ones from 8th and End Times is pretty enormous in my opinion. So, to get things kicked off, I want to talk about Stormfiends first. It's been in video games before, and it's kind of the poster boy of Warhammer ridiculousness, right? Like, we've got demonic dildo cannons, we've got building-sized titty monsters running around farting perfume, we've got sock-sniffing hermits using the dead bodies of knights as rock'em sock'em robots on the battlefield, and yet somehow, Stormfiends are near the top of the list when it comes to pants-on-head crazy unit design. These are steroid-infused rage rats surgically grafted to Gatling guns or flamethrowers like a freakish parody of Rambo or the Terminator. Stormfiends are insane, and their detractors, the people who don't want to see them in the game, look at them and say, you know what, that's way too much 40k for me, and I get that, 100% I do. Games Workshop probably huffed a bit too much warpstone when they tackle the design for these dudes. Little bit too much Space Marine, bit too much power armor, not enough dirt, not enough grime, not enough steampunk claptrap that could fall apart at any second, which is where the brilliance of Vermintide design comes into play. They took a unit that unquestionably looks fearsome and awe-inspiring, but perhaps one that doesn't fit visually with the rest of the Skaven roster, and gave it a complete facelift, one that in my opinion is incredibly effective and provides a great blueprint that Creative Assembly should try and emulate. I think Fat Shark did an amazing job with Stormfiends and frankly a lot of the unit design in Vermintide. So I think it's important to remember that CA have quite a bit of leeway with the overall design of what goes into Total War Warhammer. There are certainly details their artists have to touch on, but they can make some pretty sweeping changes. So dialing that color palette back, making the technology look more dated, adding in the dirty cloth and the steampunk vibe, it's all a great way to make it feel more grounded in the setting. But of course, visuals aren't everything. We already have a bunch of weapon teams for the Skaven, Poison Wind Mortars, Warp Grinders, Rattling Guns, and we had Warp Fire Throwers on launch. Would adding a modified Rat Ogre that can fuse any of these weapon choices to his mighty frame, going full on Bronson, just murderizing everybody, completely overshadow those that came before? Yeah, maybe. If the past year of DLC is anything to go by, there's a great chance these guys would storm out the gates completely OP. But they would sell. Well, I can't think of many other DLCs in the setting that would move product faster than Thankwall, Vermin Lords, and Stormfiends all packaged together. So from that standpoint, I feel they're pretty likely. And one of their saving graces is that they have a huge selection of weapon types to choose from, which makes it a lot easier for Creative Assembly to find a niche that hasn't been filled for them yet for the Skaven. And in my opinion, that role is best filled with either a Grinder Fist, Shot Gauntlet, or Doomflayer Gauntlet Stormfiend unit, a tier 5 armored Rat Ogre that provides some punching power in close quarters melee combat. There are ways to differentiate their range capabilities from those of the weapon teams. I'm not gonna lie, watching them mow down hordes of enemies with Warp Flame or Rattling Fire sounds way too hype to pass up, but making them more melee focused might be the easiest way to fill a role that Skaven currently lack. And at the end of the day, I feel like Stormfiends fit right in with the Warhammer Fantasy battle lore and setting in general. It's a Frankenstein mutant equipped with crazy killing contraptions. That is exactly what the Skaven are all about. That is Ratmen in a nutshell. Take some freakish experiment, do a bunch of stuff to it, make it kill things like crazy. That is exactly what they're all about. I don't see a reason why they shouldn't be in the game in some capacity, especially because modified Rat Ogres have been in the setting since like 20 years back. But I want to shift your attention to Nagash for a second here. The big boner is going to be in this trilogy, hands down. There has to be some late game threat at the southern borders of Mortal Empires, and Nagash is that threat. Whether he's there at launch or not doesn't matter, he is coming. But how do you differentiate him from the Vampire Counts and the Tomb Kings? How do you sell him as his own faction if he doesn't bring any new units with him? And the answer is, you can't really. You can make him a free LC, but you can't sell him as DLC if he has the exact same roster or some blend of just the Counts and just the Tomb Kings, which is where Morghast Archai and Harbingers come in. This is your headlining DLC unit alongside the Coven Throne when Nagash and Neferata make landfall in Warhammer 3. Now the Morghasts are an interesting unit because unlike Stormfiends and some of the other creatures on this list, from what I've gathered they were never really mentioned or even hinted at in earlier editions. They are a straight end times creation that were retconned to have been there all along during Nagash's conquests. Essentially, Patra the Sun God had an army of angels to do his bidding, agents he could send to affect the mortal plane where he could not intervene himself. These were called the Hammerite, winged bronze constructs who were sent to stop Nagash in his invasion of Nehekara. But after 40 days and 40 nights of conflict, Nagash still stood, and the Hammerite were defeated, infused with death magic, and reshaped into a more pleasing form. Raising them once more and binding them to his will, he named them his Morghast, sentient lieutenants who would lead his armies in battle and form Nagash's personal honor guard. But after getting murked by the Fellblade, Nagash and his magics no longer sustained them. He went into hiding, died essentially, and they fell silent until the end times, during the Great Necromancer's third and final resurrection, when they began to waken from their slumber. They come in two flavors. The Morghast do, Harbingers, their dual-wielding monstrous infantry with wings, and the Archai, which are their lieutenants. Those are the only ones who take orders from Nagash and nobody else. They're equipped with gigantic armor-piercing halberds. What makes them special on the tabletop, especially when it comes to monstrous infantry units, is that they have Hover, Terror, and a special rule called Heralds of the Accursed One, which reduces the damage nearby units take. Basically, they're so suffused with death magic that just their presence is enough to knit wounds and unsplinter bone for the nearby Skelly Boys and Zombos. And they have 10 leadership, which means alongside their lord, they will typically be the last undead unit to crumble. I like them a lot. Their aesthetic matches well with Nagash and the type of creature he would forge. They'd have a unique role as a tier 4 and 5 monstrous infantry with a support aura for allies, and they provide additional content for Nagash and his sub-faction when he inevitably gets added. And they don't completely outshine any of the other units. They're not going to replace Mortis engines. They're not going to replace any of those other tier 4 or 5 monstrous infantry because the vampire counts don't really have any. They have tier 3 in the Crypt Ghouls, or Crypt Horrors rather, but besides that, it's nothing really much. So I personally don't see much of a downside here at all. But Chaos is going to be the main focus of Warhammer 3, and the End Times saw both the Blood God and the Plague God receive some fun new toys. Nurgle especially got an entire army book dedicated to his invasion of Heffingen, Marienburg, and Altdorf, and with that book came the Putrid Blightkings, the exalted champions of Nurgle. Now, these guys are, for all intents and purposes, Nurgle chosen. I wouldn't mind at all if they were treated as a different unit, because they do have their own unique stat line and special rules and models, but I think there'd be an opportunity here to combine the best of both worlds. These are warriors blessed by a kiss from Blow-Brat-Spawn's demon flies. They're these tiny little parasites that skitter forth on strands of fate to find champions worthy of the Plague Father. On the tabletop, they are tank lords befitting of their Plague God. 3 wounds, 4-up armor save, high melee defense, and large weapon strength. And they have a special rule called Bountiful Blades that allows them to switch weapons at the start of each round of combat, similar to the Arm to the Teeth special rule for Black Orcs, so they can choose between great weapons, sword and shield, and dual weapons at the start of each turn, which gives them a lot of versatility and means you can kind of tailor them depending on what threat you're facing. Probably the most flavorful way to add this rule in Total War Warhammer is to give them combat stances similar to the War Dancers. So give them 3 abilities that all share a cooldown, one of which grants armor piercing, one which grants bonus versus infantry, one which gives higher missile resist and melee defense. But Black Orcs didn't get this rule, so not sure it'll happen for Putrid Blightkings either. But if they did, feel like it's probably one of the better ways to implement that so that on the fly, with a cooldown obviously, you have a chance to roll how you want them to fight. Whatever they're fighting, you say, oh, I'm up against armored infantry, I want more AP. Oh, I'm up against a bunch of low-tier chaff fodder, give them bonus versus infantry with the dual weapons, or if I'm getting shot a lot, go for the missile resist. I think it'd be fairly easy to differentiate them from standard Nurgle Chosen. You could give like Plague Size, Poison, Regen, and a different model, and they could simply make them a Regiment of Renown version, so the Putrid Blightkings would be the ROR, and then the Nurgle Chosen would just be Nurgle Chosen. A lot of ways to handle their inclusion there, but because they only exist because of the Magath Lords, I feel like we need to mention them as well. Orgoth's Demon Spew, Morbidex Twiceborn, and Blow-Brat-Spawn are the 3 brothers that make up the Magath Lords who invade the Old World during the End Times. Orgoth's is the close combat champion, Morbidex is the demonic leader of the Nurglings, and Blob is the wizard of the bunch. I don't expect to see them in Warhammer 3, they're kind of a package deal, and I don't see 3 lords being added at once, especially when we have characters like the Glotkin, who cover all those bases in a single terrifying model, but their mounts are really what make them interesting. Pox Magus, named Whippermaw, Triple Tongue, and Bilespurter, are mounts that are hands down some of the coolest designs for any unit in the Chaos arsenal. They are disgustingly perfect. And whether or not we get their riders, I think a design like this would be amazing for any Chaos Lord of Nurgle. I would really like to see them get added as a mount choice at the very least. And they vomit corrosive armor-piercing acid, so what's not to love there? Now, Khorne also got some love in the end times with Skull Reapers and Wrathmongers. Contrary to the Putrid Blightkings, I think it's a lot easier to see the Age of Sigmar influence on these models. They were clearly made with Age of Sigmar in mind. With that said, there's nothing in terms of their iconography or their overall design that truly doesn't fit in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I mean, these are exactly the same kind of mutations, weapon choices, and symbols the Warriors of Khorne have wielded for generations. So yeah, definitely over-designed and over-the-top ridiculous, but it's kind of Warhammer in a nutshell, and the aesthetics and fighting style still match what the Blood God is all about. I think the biggest challenge for Wrathmongers on the right is their choice of weapons. The dual Wrath Flails are going to be a complete nightmare to animate. I don't see a way to make them fight without their attacks clipping through themselves and allies like crazy. Not that clipping has ever really deterred CA in the past. We've seen some pretty atrocious clipping since Warhammer 1, but still, I think this would be a new level entirely. Unless you put them in units of like 12 dudes, widely spaced out, even then, I'm not sure how well that'll all work. Honestly, I feel like Khorne-chosen Berserkers with the same warrior crest the Wrathmongers have, and the rest of their marked units will more than cover the bases of both units here. They are cool, I would like to see them both, but I don't think they're remotely necessary and might just end up being more trouble than they're worth. I think Skull Reapers would be easy enough to add. The Wrathmongers with their flails, I don't know, man. That's going to be a lot of work for a unit that isn't that different than Khorne-chosen Berserkers. And the final end-type units we want to talk about here today are the Dread Abyssals, the Hounds of Syrian. These are the mounts taken by Nagash and his Mortarchs, creatures that once prowled the realm of souls, now pulled into service on the mortal plane. Each was created to feast on the souls of a specific kind of sinner, those cast into the infernos of the lower depths of the realm of souls, to torture them and their souls for all eternity, and feast on their flesh and their whatever makes them up in terms of their spiritual compound. So, just like their masters, each has their own personality and style of hunt. Ashigaroth, Gorger of the Meek, is Manfred's mount, built to hunt those too cowardly to defend themselves. Razarak, Doom of Traitors, is Arkan's mount, and was chosen as a warning to those who would defy Nagash. And Nagadron the Adivore is Neferata's Dread Abyssal, a creature who devours the gluttonous, mirroring their desire to eat and eat and eat without end. These undead doggos were driven mad with hunger during the millennia after the Great Ritual, when Nahakara was turned into a dead realm and the River of Souls stopped flowing to the underworld. But with Nagash's return, he has bound them to his will and given each of his Mortarchs their own mount. And they are terrifying, single-handedly turning decent combatants like Neferata into world beaters in melee, on top of their already impressive casting potential. What do they offer that a zombie dragon or Terrorgeist doesn't? Well, aesthetics mostly. Like Morghast, they are the kind of mount that can sell DLC based purely on visuals alone. Not to mention they would completely overhaul how Arkan or Neferata play on the battlefield itself. I wouldn't call their inclusion important, but I just think Nagash is harder to sell if he doesn't bring his new toys, and the Dread Abyssals and Morghast Archai are the two additions that would really make him feel like his own faction, rather than a repackaged Counts and Tomb Kings. But I want people to remember, I'm in no way advocating that the ending of the Total War Warhammer trilogy match up with the end of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Adding an End Times expansion, or End Times units, or End Times characters does not mean it concludes with the world blowing up. There is no set narrative in Total War. It's a sandbox game. That's the entire point. You forge your own story. So, getting the Glotkin and Nagash and Stormfiends or Dread Abyssals or any of that stuff shouldn't be a bad thing. It's more Warhammer goodness. That's what we all want for the most part. For some reason, I think people have a hard time separating the two. So just because these units came in a expansion to Warhammer Fantasy Battle Tabletop that you did not like, doesn't mean that the units themselves are bad or not fitting. I think that's up for debate for sure, but I wouldn't say it's like an automatic thing, and I feel like some people treat it like it is. There are plenty of reasons to not appreciate the design of the models themselves, but in my opinion, most of these are quintessential Warhammer. They fill a unique niche in their rosters that is thematic and true to their faction's lore and identity on the battlefield, and as long as an End Times unit checks those boxes, I feel like they have a place in the game. So, let me know, are there any of these units that you feel like straight up don't deserve to be in the setting at all, that should not come in Total War Warhammer 3 or in Mortal Empires? Do you hate them all because you hate the End Times? Or are you on board with every single one we covered in this list? Looking forward to that discussion. Should be interesting at the very least, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.